In the grand theater of American history, some figures command the stage with speeches and legislation. Others wield power from the shadows with a whispered word or a well-placed secret. And then there are those who simply crash the party, rewrite the script, and set the entire stage on fire with the sheer force of their personality. This is the story of one such woman, a woman born in the shadow of an unspeakable tragedy, raised in the gilded cage of the White House, who refused to be a footnote in her father's story and instead became a legend in her own right. She was a walking contradiction, an aristocrat with a rebel's heart, a Republican who befriended Democrats, a celebrated socialite who harbored deep private pain. Her own father, the formidable President Theodore Roosevelt, once famously surrendered, exclaiming to a friend, "I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I cannot do both." He chose to run the country. Alice chose to run her own life. This is the epic, electrifying, and often heartbreaking story of the woman they called Princess Alice, the original American celebrity, the unsinkable Alice Roosevelt Longworth. To understand the explosion that was Alice Roosevelt, you first have to understand the world she was born into. The year was 1884. America was deep in its Gilded Age, a time of staggering wealth and crushing poverty, of glittering new fortunes, built on the backs of an industrializing nation. It was an era of rigid social codes, especially for women of the upper class. A woman's value was measured by her piety, her purity, her domesticity, and her obedience. Her world was meant to be the home, her ambition confined to securing a suitable husband and managing a household. Public life, politics, and personal freedom were the exclusive domains of men. Into this world of corsets and conformity came Theodore Roosevelt, a man who was a force of nature himself. He was a burgeoning politician from a wealthy New York family, brimming with ambition and a philosophy he called the strenuous life. He was energetic, intellectual, and deeply in love with his beautiful young wife, Alice Hathaway Lee, a woman he described in his diary as beautiful in face and form, and lovelier still in spirit. They were the golden couple of New York society. In early 1884, their happiness seemed complete as they awaited the birth of their first child. But on February 12, 1884, that idyllic world shattered into a million pieces. Alice Lee Roosevelt was born, a healthy baby girl. But just 2 days later, on Valentine's Day, an unimaginable tragedy struck the Roosevelt home. In a cruel twist of fate, both Theodore's young wife and his beloved mother, Mitty, died in the same house on the same day. Alice from an undiagnosed kidney disease and Mitty from typhoid fever. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who would become a symbol of American strength, was utterly broken. In his diary that night, he drew a large black X across the page and wrote a single devastating sentence: "The light has gone out of my life." The grief was so profound, so all-consuming, that he made a solemn vow he would never again speak the name of his departed wife. And in doing so, he effectively erased the identity of the tiny infant who bore her name. He couldn't bear to look at his daughter, this living reminder of his lost love. He handed the baby, Alice, over to his sister Anna, known as Bamie, and fled west to the Badlands of Dakota to lose himself in the harsh life of a cowboy to heal his wounded soul. This was Alice's brutal entry into the world, born of a great love, but immediately orphaned by a great tragedy, and abandoned by a father consumed by his own monumental grief. This primal wound, this deep-seated feeling of being an inconvenient reminder of a painful past, would become the furnace in which her rebellious, attention-seeking, and fiercely independent spirit was forged. Alice's early years were spent in the care of her Aunt Mamie, a woman of formidable intelligence and character who provided the stability her grieving father could not. But the shadow of her father's absence and the ghost of the mother she never knew loomed large. When Theodore eventually returned and remarried to his childhood friend Edith Caro, the family dynamic became even more complex. Edith was a reserved, conventional woman who valued discipline and order above all else. She gave Theodore 5 more children and created the loving, boisterous family life he craved. But for Alice, her stepmother represented everything she was not: quiet, dutiful, and predictable. Edith tried to tame the wild spirit of her stepdaughter, but her attempts at discipline only served as a red flag to a bull. Alice, feeling like an outsider in her own family, responded by pushing every boundary she could find. She was a voracious reader, devouring books in the family library, but she was also a hellion. She slid down the banisters, tormented her younger half-siblings, and developed a cynical, sharp-tongued wit as a defense mechanism. She learned early on that being good got her overlooked, but being outrageous got her noticed. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Then, in September 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was suddenly thrust into the presidency. At 17 years old, Alice Roosevelt moved into the White House, and the nation was about to be introduced to a first daughter unlike any it had ever seen. The staid, formal atmosphere of the executive mansion was no match for the whirlwind that was Princess Alice. She wasn't just a resident of the White House, she took it over. She saw it not as a hallowed institution, but as the ultimate playground. While her stepmother Edith tried to maintain a sense of decorum, Alice was a one-woman wrecking crew of social convention. She smoked cigarettes, often on the White House roof, a shocking act for any woman at the time, let alone the president's daughter. When an aide warned her that it was unladylike, she reportedly replied, "It's refreshing." She had a pet garter snake, which she named Emily Spinach, a jab at her cousin Eleanor, who she found plain and boring, and a reference to a society matron named Emily Spinach, who was similarly uninspiring. Alice would carry the snake in her purse to parties, delighting in the horrified gasps of Washington's elite ladies when she produced it. She drove her own light blue roadster, a rarity for a woman, and tore through the city streets with a joyful disregard for speed limits. She was a regular at the local horse track, placing bets with bookies, another activity strictly considered the province of men. Her social life was relentless. She attended parties almost every night, dancing until dawn, charming ambassadors, and breaking the hearts of countless young men who were both terrified and mesmerized by her. She once jumped, fully clothed, into the swimming pool of a ship during a party. When her escapades made headlines, as they often did, she showed no remorse. She was creating a brand, a persona of the rebellious modern woman who lived by her own rules. The American public was utterly captivated. A song was written in her honor, Alice Bluegown, which became a massive hit and cemented her status as a national fashion icon. The particular shade of light blue she favored became known simply as Alice Blue. She was, in every sense of the word, America's first modern celebrity. Her every move, every outfit, every witty remark was breathlessly reported in the newspapers. While the public adored her, her father was in a state of constant exasperation. He was trying to bust corporate trusts, build the Panama Canal, and project American power across the globe. And back at home, he was fielding daily complaints about his daughter's latest outrage. The famous quote, "I can either run the country or I can control Alice," was not a boast. It was a sigh of weary resignation. He tried to rein her in, but it was a futile effort. He sent her on a grand diplomatic tour of Asia in 1905 with a large congressional delegation, hoping the responsibility would mature her. Instead, she turned it into her own personal world tour of rebellion. In Japan, she jumped into a sumo wrestling ring. In the Philippines, she fired a pistol off the side of their naval vessel. She charmed a Korean emperor and flirted with military officers, creating both diplomatic goodwill and a string of minor international incidents. Through it all, Alice was keenly aware of her power. She wasn't just a wild child. She was a savvy public figure who understood the media and knew how to use it to her advantage. Her rebellion wasn't just youthful folly. It was a calculated declaration of independence from her father's suffocating fame and the tragic legacy of her mother. She was refusing to be a victim of her past, choosing instead to be the audacious architect of her own future. In the midst of her reign as Princess Alice, Washington was abuzz with speculation about who could possibly tame this beautiful, untamable woman. The answer, it seemed, came in the form of Nicholas Longworth, a Republican congressman from Ohio. He was handsome, charming, a talented pianist, and 15 years her senior. More importantly, he was ambitious and politically astute. To many, it seemed like a perfect match, a union of the Roosevelt political dynasty with a rising star in the Republican Party. Their wedding in 1906 was the social event of the decade. Held in the East Room of the White House, it was a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur. Alice, wearing a magnificent gown and carrying a bouquet of flowers, used her father's military sword, a relic from his Rough Rider days, to cut the enormous wedding cake. Thousands of onlookers crowded the streets outside, hoping for a glimpse of the celebrity couple. It was a fairy tale wedding, but it would not have a fairy tale ending. The initial passion quickly cooled. Nicholas Longworth, for all his charm, was also a notorious philanderer and a heavy drinker. The marriage soon devolved into an arrangement of convenience and mutual understanding. They lived largely separate lives, united by their shared social and political ambitions, but seeking emotional and physical intimacy elsewhere. Alice, never one to play the part of the long-suffering wife, responded to his infidelities with her own. Her affairs were numerous and often conducted with a defiant openness that scandalized even the most jaded Washington insiders. But one relationship stood apart from all the others, a deep, decades-long connection that would define much of her adult life. His name was William Borah, the powerful and enigmatic Republican senator from Idaho. Borah was a towering figure in the Senate, known as the Lion of Idaho. He was a brilliant orator, a fierce intellectual, and a staunch isolationist. He was also a married man, but in Alice he found a mind that was his equal. Theirs was not just a passionate affair, it was a meeting of two of the sharpest intellects in Washington. They shared a love of political strategy, a cynical view of human nature, and a disdain for mediocrity. For decades, their relationship was the Capitol's most titillating open secret. They would be seen taking long walks together, engaged in deep conversation. He was a constant presence in her life, a confidant and intellectual partner in a way her husband never was. The whispers surrounding Alice reached a crescendo in 1925. At the age of 41, long after most people assumed she would remain childless, Alice gave birth to her only child, a daughter she named Paulina. Nicholas Longworth, who by then was Speaker of the House, doted on the child publicly, but privately, and throughout the drawing rooms of Washington, no one believed he was the father. The math of their estranged lives, combined with the undeniable intimacy between Alice and Senator Borah, led to a single unspoken conclusion. Paulina was William Borah's daughter. Alice, in her characteristic style, masterfully navigated the scandal by refusing to engage with it. She never confirmed the rumors, but she never convincingly denied them either. She allowed the ambiguity to hang in the air, a testament to her power to control her own narrative. In her memoirs, written decades later, she would coyly write, "All the old gossips and all the young gossips, male and female, had the time of their lives." The paternity of her daughter became another piece of the Alice Roosevelt Longworth legend, a symbol of her ultimate defiance of social norms. She had found a way to have it all: the security of a political marriage, the intellectual passion of a great love affair, and the experience of motherhood, all on her own scandalous terms. Her husband Nicholas died in 1931, leaving her a widow, but her relationship with Bora continued until his death in 1940. She had outlived both of the central men in her life, standing alone once more as she had in the beginning. Freed from the constraints of being a politician's wife, Alice entered the most powerful phase of her life. She transformed her stately home on Massachusetts Avenue into the unofficial center of Washington power, a salon that rivaled any in the great capitals of Europe. For more than 50 years, her drawing room was the place where the most important conversations happened. It became known as the Other Washington Monument, and Alice was its witty, formidable, and sometimes cruel high priestess. An invitation to one of Alice's gatherings was the most coveted social ticket in town. Here, powerful senators, ambitious young congressmen, crusty cabinet secretaries, sharp-witted journalists, and foreign diplomats would mingle over cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. But they weren't there for the food. They were there for the conversation and for Alice herself. With an almost supernatural insight, she could dissect a political issue, predict an election outcome, or eviscerate a politician's character with a single, perfectly crafted epigram. She was a living repository of political history, a human bridge connecting the world of her father with the modern nuclear age. Her sofa became a legendary piece of furniture. On it sat a needlepoint pillow embroidered with her most famous motto, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." And people flocked to do just that. They came to trade gossip, to float ideas, to gauge the political winds, and to be entertained by her legendary wit. She once described her neighbor, the famously dull Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, as the only bull I know who carries his own china shop with him. Of President Calvin Coolidge, who was so famously silent, she remarked, "He looks as if he was weaned on a pickle." No one was immune to her sharp tongue, least of all her own family. She harbored a deep and lasting animosity for her distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his wife Eleanor. Alice, a staunch Republican like her father, viewed FDR's New Deal policies as a betrayal of American principles. But her dislike was also deeply personal. She saw Franklin as a pale imitation of her father, and she was particularly merciless towards Eleanor, who was her first cousin. Alice resented Eleanor's public persona of saintly do-gooding, which she found sanctimonious and tiresome. She would famously perform a devastatingly accurate and cruel imitation of Eleanor's high-pitched voice and protruding teeth for the delight of her guests. She saw Eleanor's activism as a form of self-aggrandizement and dismissed her as a bore. This one-sided family feud became a fixture of Washington life, a bitter counterpoint to the Roosevelt political dynasty that dominated the era. Alice positioned herself as the keeper of the true Roosevelt legacy, the legacy of her father, Theodore, against the perceived heresy of the other Roosevelts in the White House. Despite her rock-ribbed republicanism, Alice's only true allegiance was to intelligence and entertainment. She cultivated friendships across the political aisle, delighting in anyone she found interesting, regardless of their party. In the 1960s, she struck up a warm friendship with the Kennedys. She admired John F. Kennedy's charm and intelligence, and he was fascinated by her. She later became a confidant to Lyndon B. Johnson, who appreciated her brutally honest political advice. She even developed a strange, close friendship with Richard Nixon, a man whom many in her social circle despised. She saw in him a complex, fascinating, and deeply flawed character. "He is the most interesting politician of my time," she once said. "What's not to like?" Her salon was one of the few places in a deeply partisan Washington where people of all political stripes could meet, argue, and laugh, all under the watchful, discerning eye of their brilliant and intimidating hostess. She never held office, but for half a century, she was one of the most influential people in the Capitol, a power broker who operated not with votes or money, but with the far more potent weapons of access, information, and a devastating wit. For all her public bravado, her glittering social life, and her formidable intellect, Alice Roosevelt Longworth's life was also a study in profound loss and private sorrow. Her 96 years on Earth were a long, lonely exercise in survival. She outlived her parents, her stepmother, all her siblings, her husband, her lover, and nearly all of her contemporaries. She became a magnificent relic from a bygone era, but the price of that longevity was to watch everyone she loved disappear. The most devastating blow came in 1957. Her daughter, Paulina, the child born of scandal and secrecy, had lived a troubled life. She struggled with mental health issues and a dependence on alcohol and pills, a fragile soul crushed by the weight of her famous family and her own inner demons. At the age of 31, Paulina died from an overdose of sleeping pills. While the official cause was accidental, the tragedy was shrouded in ambiguity and immense sadness. For Alice, the famously stoic and unsentimental matriarch, the loss of her only child was an unbearable grief. The woman who had faced down presidents and weathered every political storm was shattered. But in public, she maintained her iron composure. She rarely spoke of Paulina's death, burying her pain beneath layers of wit and cynicism. It was in this moment of ultimate tragedy that she had to summon her deepest reserves of strength. She took on the full-time care of her teenage granddaughter, Joanna. In her 70s, she once again found herself in the role of a parent, raising a child in the shadow of loss. This late chapter of her life revealed a different side of Alice, a fiercely protective, loving, though still demanding grandmother. She had found a new purpose in the wreckage of her deepest sorrow. Her long life made her a living witness to an almost unimaginable sweep of history. She was born when the U.S. had only 38 states and the Civil War was a fresh memory. She died in 1980 when the world was defined by the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and the dawn of the computer age. She lived through 18 presidents, from Chester A. Arthur to Jimmy Carter. She had known them all, observed them all, and judged them all. In her final years, she remained a fixture in Washington, a grand dame holding court, her mind still razor sharp even as her body grew frail. She would tell reporters who came to interview her, "I'm a museum piece, you know, but I'm a feisty museum piece." She continued to offer her unfiltered opinions on current events, her pronouncements still making headlines. She never lost her spark, her defiant energy, her refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was. Alice Roosevelt Longworth passed away on February 20th, 1980, just after her 96th birthday. She left behind a legacy that is impossible to categorize. Was she a proto-feminist who shattered glass ceilings with her audacity? Was she a political insider who wielded immense, unaccountable power? Was she a tragic figure, forever seeking the attention of a father lost to grief? She was, of course, all of these things and more. In the end, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was more than just a collection of witty quotes and scandalous anecdotes. She was a testament to the art of survival. From the initial trauma of her birth, she learned that she had to be louder, smarter, and more outrageous than anyone else just to claim her own space in the world. She crafted a persona of impenetrable armor, using her wit as both a sword and a shield. She was a woman who refused to be defined by the men in her life, not by her famous father, her unfaithful husband, or her powerful lover. She built her own kingdom in a city of men, on her own terms. Her life reminds us that history is not just a sequence of great events, but a tapestry woven from the threads of complex, contradictory, and unforgettable human lives. Alice never wrote a law, signed a treaty, or held a formal title, yet for the better part of a century, she was at the very heart of American power. She was a force of nature, a national treasure, and a magnificent, glorious troublemaker. She was the one and only other Washington Monument, a woman made not of marble, but of fire and wit, who refused to be silent, refused to be ignored, and refused to be anything less than utterly, incandescently herself.